Hello and welcome to Legislative Report. I'm Laurie Bull, and today's topic is education funding. Is it fair? Is it working? And if not, how can we fix it? And here is Representative Seth Grove from Dover area in York, and here to talk about that. And Representative Grove, before we get into some ideas that you have as far as how to address the funding, can you just set the table for the discussion and tell us how our schools currently funded?
Education funding basically flows from three sources. The federal government gives money for IDEA, Title I, Title II, basically special education funding. They were supposed to fund it at the 40% level. I don't think it's ever really reached there. Right now, statewide, it's funding for special education to our school districts roughly about 17%. So the federal government really hasn't kicked in their share. Will they at any point? I doubt it, especially with the amount of fiscal concerns they have down in D.C., borrowing money that they don't have to spend from taxpayers in foreign countries and so forth. So I doubt we'll ever see that 40% coming from the federal government. The state gives money in a whole slew of different pots of money. The largest is the basic education funding. It's proposed roughly at about $5.8 billion. The next highest is actually special education, which is a little over $1 billion. So we do give school districts over $1 billion for special education funding. And there's other line items, reimbursement for student pupil transportation, Social Security reimbursement. So there's a multitude of other line items within the education budget, roughly about $9 billion the state spends on public education in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we're talking a lot of money that flows into education year in and year out from the state. And then at the local level, the number one funding source for school districts is the local property tax. I know every school district in York County has an earned income tax that roughly ranges, the bulk of them have a 0.5% earned income tax. Being a Dover resident, we have a 0.9%. There are some, I believe West Shore is a little 1% or higher, roughly. And interestingly enough, their 1% EIT also allows them not to have such high property tax. They actually have the lowest millage rates in the entire county. And then there's a slew of nuisance taxes school districts have. We've tried to get away from the head tax, the occupational tax. We authorized legislation, maybe a decade old now, to allow school districts to eliminate the occupational tax for an increase in earned income tax and so forth. So it's a slew. Generally, the two bulks are state funding and then the local property tax.
How does the current system as it's working now, how does it fail places like York County?
Basically, in 1991, we had a tough budget year. Governor Casey was the governor at the time. There was a personal income tax increase. They decided to flatline education that year. And in so, not necessarily the most horrific act, but for us, they eliminated the student funding, the student growth portion of the education funding formula. Now, year in, year out, we really don't have an education funding formula moving forward. Basically, you adopt the previous year's education. We have hold harmless. That basically says school districts won't get any less money from the previous year to keep them harmless of any maneuvering with education funding. And what that has done over the past 2 decades is created in growth areas who add students every single year, discrepancy between how much they get per student compared to those areas of the state that have a stagnant or decreasing student population. So we're really not on par. And obviously the cost driver in education are students. The more you have, the more costs, whether it's new buildings, obviously you need to hire personnel to teach those students and so forth. So there's a cost attributed to that moving forward. Now, that's not the only reason. And what has happened is school districts dip to the local taxpayers and property taxes to raise revenue to kind of meet those financial needs. Now, it's just more than that when you're talking about property tax increases. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes than just that education funding formula. It's part of it, but again, we do give school districts billions of dollars a year for their local costs. The other aspect are mandates. The state government has mandates coming down, the federal government has mandates, and that was part of the deal with the special education funding. The federal government said, we'll cover 40% of your special education costs because we're adopting these mandates for special education. Obviously, they haven't ever come close to that 40% mark. And then you have court cases. When judges make decisions, it usually drives up costs for school districts. So it's just added cost upon added cost moving forward. So there's a lot in that realm as well.
Let's talk about the state budget a little bit this year. Realizing it's just a proposal at this point and it's just the governor's proposal at this point, what type of investment is being proposed to be put into our basic education?
Yeah, after basically being flat funded for 2 years, the governor would like to see a $90 million increase in basic education funding to school districts. And what's really great about this is the governor's recognized the plight of the growing school districts and the way the funding formula has been inequitable throughout the years. So he actually put forth a funding formula that actually includes growth built into it. So that really benefits our growing school districts across Pennsylvania. And it's something, if he wanted to get votes, obviously, for the budget, if you're putting new education money on the table, I think he realized in order to get a budget done, you're going to have to appease those of us in the growing school districts who have been really hammering our colleagues and governors for years to get a change that's feasible. And I think this is the middle ground. If you look at growing school districts, non-growth school districts make up about 265 of our 500 school districts. So over half like status quo, like the way things are. So for us in the growing areas, a minority of Pennsylvania, and that's not Republican, that's not Democrat, that is just your general geography and the amount of growth you have in your area, we'll flat out get basically unvoted. We all get the votes to actually make those changes, especially if you go in and say, let's get rid of home harmless and reallocate that money based on need and equitable and fairness to students.
Why would those members want to vote for something that would actually take some money away from them, or at least change the distribution?
Yeah, and if you would take that $5.8 billion and actually distribute it per student, you would actually see 265 school districts lose money, some to the tune of $300 million.
And that's a tough sell.
Yep, that's a tough sell. So you're not gonna get the votes to do it, but what you can do is moving forward, change the system. Basically say, all right, keep what you have. We're not going to get into the battle of what has happened because it happened. You know, we're not going to make up 20 years of a funding formula overnight, but we can make the adjustments now and correct the atrocities of the past so we don't have to deal with it in the future. So I definitely praise the governor for taking leadership and building that into the funding formula. And you look at York County, the largest increase percentage-wise was York Suburban, between 3 and 4%. One of the lowest was York City, at about 1.3. But when you look at the actual number breakdown, because York Suburban gets such small amount, you know, their increase, their huge, 3 or 4% increase is only $94,000 versus York City, which is about $363,000. So it's $90 million. It's not $90 billion, but it's a start, and it's a positive start.
Right. And also, the past two budgets, basic education has been funded at historic levels from the state standpoint.
Yeah, so we put in more money in basic education than we ever have as a Commonwealth. Obviously, the $90 million will once again raise the bar to how much money we've put in. And as other states were cutting stuff like special education, we didn't touch it. We held it harmless. It's been 5 years since there's been an increase in it, but it hasn't been cut. And I think that's an important message to send out there, that it's such an important allocation to help our most needy students that it wasn't touched, and we left that status quo while a lot of the other line items in the budget have been cut for the past 2 years previously. So, but we had to close out a $4.2 billion shortfall. We did it without raising taxes. I think you've seen our personal income tax, corporate net income taxes increasing because we're doing the work we're supposed to be. We're getting our budget in line with the economic realities of today. And since we're seeing inflationary increases in those two line items, we can put some money back into the budget to try to rebuild and be precise about it to where we need to be.
Moving on to another topic, you had used the word mandate earlier. Often government provides a set of rules that need to be followed, but maybe don't always give the resources, i.e. the cash, to follow those rules, and that's often called an unfunded mandate. Can you just talk about that and some thoughts you had on that?
Yeah, being state government, we created local governments cities, boroughs, townships, the municipalities. We created school districts. Basically, they're agents of the state. We give them authority to do certain things, collect taxes. Local governments do zoning, that kind of stuff. School districts obviously operate the day-to-day operations of school districts. Having 500 of them, I'm not sure it's a role the state government wants to be in to do the day-to-day management. But with all these entities, we set the rules. We do allocate revenue to them from the state, and obviously they have their own revenue sources too. In case they want to do more expansive stuff than what the state offers them money to do, it gives them the tools for the community to make a decision that, we're either going to live with what the state gives us, or we have higher expectations, so we're going to raise taxes at the local level to give us the education we want, or if it's local government, the roads or whatever local government job is, whatever they want to do. So it does give them a lot of discretion in being able to do that. Now, part of that is, since we set the rules, we also set guidance. And a lot of times we have, whether it's the federal government or judiciary or state government, there's new requirements on local governments, especially school districts, almost day in and day out. So how do they keep up pace with unfunded mandates? They either build it within their budgets or they ask taxpayers to raise taxes.
Can you give an example of what one would be like at the school district level?
A big one for actually all local governments is actually prevailing wage. It was put in place in 1963. It was supposed to be the prevailing wage of an area. Since then, it's kind of transformed itself into a higher rate than every area in Pennsylvania, York County included. I've seen statistics where it increases construction costs between 10 and 15%, up to 30%. So basically, taxpayers are paying more for every single construction project that's done. And with court cases coming down, it now includes maintenance. Whatever you do has to have that prevailing wage built into it. So it's a huge concern for taxpayers, especially when you talk about the amount of, because we're a growth area, how much building school districts have done in York County over the years. That's a cost, and that's on the backs of taxpayers, and even those who collect that tax. Their taxes are going up, and you got to often wonder if if the school district weren't paying prevailing wage, if at the end of the day those workers would still be whole. If their taxes would have been lower, they probably would have been at the same point, whether they had prevailing wage or not had prevailing wage. But that's probably the largest mandate that's talked about. Now, moving forward, sitting on the House Education Committee, we are looking at trying to reduce costs for school districts. We did a lot of work last session on it. Hopefully, we can move forward with some good common sense approaches to alleviate costs of school districts, thus ensuring that they won't need to raise taxes for costs of education. I proposed House Bill 780, which is a mandate waiver program, and we had that. It was actually passed in our school empowerment bill about 2000, 2001 timeframe. It sunset in about 2009, 2010. So school districts didn't have that tool to say, we have an unfunded mandate, we're going to waive it, get approval from the Department of Education on waiving it, and they wouldn't have to pay those costs. Bidding, it's a lot of stuff that really adds up over time. Unfortunately, prevailing wage was never part of that. My House Bill 780 is actually very expansive, because what it does is say you can't waive certain criteria, civil rights, special education, certain things that you just can't waive or are critical to the day-to-day operation of school districts. But everything else is open. You can waive it. I think that's an important step in order to give school districts the tools they need to balance their budget and protect taxpayers of undue costs. Now, we've asked before, give us a list of mandates and give us a list of costs. Some school districts really haven't been able to get a lot of costs associated with some of these mandates, but hopefully giving them the tools to be able to waive them, it'll help reduce the cost of education moving forward. I know my bill is not slated to move. A colleague of mine, Dan Truitt, has House Bill, I think it's 135. That's the exact mandate waiver program that was introduced. We are tweaking it to make it easier and more convenient for school districts to utilize it, but at least that tool will be there. And then obviously moving forward, we can look at adding new stuff to it. But just getting a program, the reinstating of that program, I think will go far to really helping school districts balance their budgets.
Another tool that gives more flexibility is the block grant.
Yeah.
Can you define that? And you have another bill, House Bill 893.
Yeah, House Bill 893 was actually developed from the governor's proposal last budget, where he wanted to do block grants for counties and school districts. The county one actually ended up being a pilot program where 20 counties were able to do it. There were actually about 30 or 35 counties that applied to get into it. They obviously took 20. It's been very successful. What it does is there's certain line items in the budget, and the state says you can only use these line items for this, 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 and this. When you look at county human services, some individuals move between those spectrums. So it doesn't make sense to lock you in there when, or there's a case of you may not need all your money for MHMR, you may need it for drug and alcohol. So if you have leftover state money, instead of giving it back to the state, allow them to maneuver money where they need it for that year. So I thought it was critical that we give not only counties but school districts that same tool. If you have, obviously for 500 school districts, we don't know what the cost drivers are for all 500 school districts. When we give them money, they might not need it for X amount. So let's take away the restrictions on it and say, you do what you do best. You know your school district, you know your cost drivers. Use the state allocation to balance your budgets. And that's I think, a mandate in itself to tell the school districts you have to use it for X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. You don't have any other choice when you may need cost drivers.
Well, certainly that promotes local control,
yeah.
which is, an important thing in our school system.
It is. And I think anybody wants to be able to go to their school board to go there, let the school board know this is happening with my kid, or I want this done or that done. I think it's a critical decision. People like that local identity and stuff. What also neat is about this block grant is it creates a base allocation. So any money in that block grant that the school districts get, they have and they keep. But moving forward, any new money put in that block grant is actually done by a foundation formula. So let's say it's $90 million this year. You take that $90 million, you divide it by the number of students enrolled in public education in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and each school district will get that per student allocation based on their students. So you basically set it up that all children are equal in the state. They all deserve the same funding, and they all are on the equal playing field moving forward. So I think that's a critical step in this block grant proposal as well.
And then moving on to another topic that you've also addressed as we've talked here today, and that's special education. What ideas are in this House Bill 2 that you voted for that would help with special education? I
think this is a critical step in reforming how we allocate and fund special education. Obviously, currently we spend over $1 billion in this state. Now that's sent down to school districts, and this is something else that happened in 1991. Basically, the General Assembly and the governor at that time said, we're going to give you 16% of your student, assume 16% of your student population are special education students, and that's what we're going to fund you. So if you have a school district that happens to have 16% of their population,
great.
they make it out. They actually are getting what they need. We have school districts where it's 20 or 22% of their population, so they're underfunded. We have other school districts that may be 10%, and they're overfunded. So what House Bill 2 does is set up a commission to look at the current funding system. How do we make it on a needs basis, and also classification? When you're talking special education, you could have
a wide range.
High level,
sure,
low level. Obviously, depending on where you are at the spectrum, your allocation should be based on the need. If you have somebody that just has a speech impediment and just needs someone working with them one day versus someone who needs a full-time individual, a teacher and aide with them 24 hours, obviously that individual needs a larger allocation. So it's a fundamental reform that I think will truly revolutionize how we fund special education, get away from our archaic assumption of 16%, and actually get the money to the kids who need it most, and come up with a very fair way of doing it. So Bernie ONeill, colleague of mine, that was his bill. He's been working on it for a long time and is actually a special education teacher too.
I was going to say that's his background. So
yeah, so it's something capstone of definitely his career, trying to take care of an issue he has a great passion for.
Is that, talking about York County, is special education funding a big issue in York County?
It is. We have some school districts who this year actually had costs decrease because they had students graduate. But again, you could have a kid move into your district or start school for 18 years that has a six-figure price tag. School districts don't have an option not to take a kid. You know, they have to take them. They have to educate every student who walks in that door and give them, you know, a quote free education. So it's imperative we find solutions to help our school districts come up with fair funding to help them out and make sure those students get the best education they can wherever they're being educated at.
At one point in time in Pennsylvania history, there was a portion of tax that went to education. I guess it was the sales tax.
Yep.
You're looking at kind of revisiting this concept with a twist on it.
Yeah, 2% of the 6% sales tax went to education funding. We had a 4%. I think the General Assembly just wanted to increase taxes and get more money, so they used the guises for education. So they did 1% and then about 1953, and then they upped it to another percent. So there was 2% dedicated to education, which was a good thing because whenever we get our budgets, I know 203 House members kind of toss the actual budget aside and look at the allocation per school district to see what their schools get. Now, if 203 House members across ideology, party lines, are first and foremost looking at how much their schools are getting, wouldn't it be prudent if we set them up for success and ensure that at least inflationary increases are built into the budget? And I think that's where we were at in 1953. You really didn't see huge property taxes increases until you really shifted that dedicated funding into the general fund. And the theory was, you know, by not dedicating that money, it gives the General Assembly the ability to dictate where the money goes and we'll know best where to put it. Now we've come full circle back around to a time when we're not giving those inflationary increases, and we've seen property taxes creep up, and school districts are saying we don't have enough for inflationary increases. So what this would do is dedicate 1.2% of the personal income tax to education. That equates to about $50 million a year increase. Now what's interesting, if you look at the block grant, there are certain line items that block grant. Pupil transportation, that's reimbursable. Social Security reimbursements to school districts, and then non-public transportation costs. Those are all we reimburse for the previous year, so it's exact cost. Right now, those four increases about $14 million. The highest I've seen them is about $26 million. So when you look at this allocation, we're basically saying we're going to cover the cost of those reimbursements moving forward, inflationary increases, plus give you about $25 million more per year guaranteed. And that's kind of like your base number. Obviously, if revenues come in and we want to give more, we still can. What it also does is allow school districts better budgeting. They'll know more what they're getting
a little more predictable.
Yeah, because right now it's, you know,
they're waiting for that
exactly.
June 30th deadline to see what they're going to get.
Yeah, they start budgeting in January, so you start getting the conversations of, well, what are we going to get this year?
Right.
What are we going to, and you know, the governor does his budget address in February. We have until June 30th to get a budget done. They have until June 30th to get a budget done. So they won't know until we have a finalized budget how much we're going to get. Now, what's interesting this year, you know, it's tough to say a guarantee, but more than likely we're going to try to fund that $90 million as a minimum for school districts moving forward. That's still up in the air, but I think that's the direction we're going to try to go in moving forward. But as we move January month by month, what's nice is the Secretary of Revenue always comes out with how much revenue we're getting from each tax structure. So school districts can come back and say, oh, we're seeing, you know, 3% increase year to year, so they can kind of calculate that in with their budget. And this money is actually dedicated to the block grant, so all they have to do is do the math, and it becomes very easy for them to analyze how much roughly about each school district is going to get moving forward. So I think it makes it a lot easier on them to budget. Not to mention inflationary increases, you know, we take that off the table. By providing for inflationary increases, we take it off the table so they can't go back to taxpayers and say, well, inflationary increases, we need to raise taxes.
Well, we only have probably about 2 minutes left. And we have a very weighty topic at
Yeah.
the end here, and that's property taxes. And
Yeah.
you had a plan last session that you put forward, and I guess you're putting forward a similar plan this session?
Yeah. Last session I put forward a local option property tax elimination that would allow counties to do a 1% sales tax, and that would go to school districts for millage rate reductions, and then allow school districts for the rest of the elimination of property taxes to raise their earned income tax or switch out their personal income tax to eliminate it. Heard loud and clear from the business community they don't support a sales tax, especially when you look at your county. We have a lot of border bleed from Maryland and so forth. Not to mention statewide perspective, it just wasn't a popular tool moving forward, devastating to the business community and so forth. So we came back and retooled it. It would allow each school district to eliminate their property taxes for an earned income tax, business privilege tax, or mercantile tax. So business privilege and a mercantile tax are taxes on businesses. They're gross receipts. I actually read a report from a professor in Kentucky who was analyzing the history of sales tax, and they consider the mercantile tax as the first sales tax that was developed in Pennsylvania a long time ago. But basically those gross receipts tax and the EIT combined form the elimination tax, which gives the authority for once for school districts just to eliminate their property taxes.
Well, I tell you what, if that gets accomplished, you'll be hailed as a hero statewide, I believe.
Yeah, hopefully we can get it going. Last time my bill moved easily out of committee, got stuck on the House floor because of that sales tax issue. I talked to a lot of organizations that opposed it, and to date a lot of them have come back and say, well, this is the best plan we've seen to date on property tax elimination, and a lot of their feedback really wasn't based on that plan. It was a lot of other stuff that actually the slew of stuff we went over today solves a lot of issues resulting from education funding. And someday, hopefully, we get education funding off the table and the financing of education. Someday I would actually like to talk about how to best educate our kids rather than the funding aspect.
That's the perfect way to end the program today, because that really is the focus of all the things we've discussed today. Well, thank you for your time, and that is all the time that we have today. If you have any questions for Representative Grove on some of the education issues we talked about today, please feel free to contact him at his local office. That information will be shown in just a minute. Thanks for watching, and join us next time for Legislative Report.